going to do a quick summary of last night because I want to follow on that thought into desire and go deeper into that. And we might have a break in between two sessions tonight. We'll see how it goes. So, last night we started looking at desire from the point of view as a dynamic movement that forms us. We are reflective beings by nature. And by nature we do not find our existence or our freedom in isolation. Human beings, more than any other creatures, find their existence in relationship with others. In fact, not one of us would be here unless there was an intimate relationship between others. Okay, so we have our very beginning in relationship, in intimacy, and we continue to be formed through the relational movements, and the most unconscious quality that we reflect is desire. We started looking at, can I say, the ultimate mimetic desire when we looked at Genesis 1:26. Here we've got the otherness of God, we've got man made in his image and likeness, and there's anticipation as to what is going to animate man, what's going to begin this life. And we read in verse 28, and God adored man and blessed man with gifts of rulership and stewardship over his creation. That is a picture of ideal mimesis, because we can go through so many other scriptures. I'll just give one example. John 17 verse 24. Jesus tells us of a time before the world began. And this time before the world began wasn't a place of boring sameness. He speaks of a place where there was a dynamic relationship between Father, Son, and Spirit. The love that you gave me, the honor that you gave me before this world began. In other words, all of creation was not birthed out of a sense of need or lack, but it was the overflow of God's own creative, expressive nature that brings about all that is. So creation in a way is absolutely, completely unnecessary. God was doing fine without it. And his imagination to bring us about wasn't just to irritate himself with creatures that's going to limit him and frustrate him throughout his existence. It is out of this place of abundance that the God who is too much overflows in the beauty of all that is. And we started looking at how this passage started challenging the religious superstitions of the day. Can you imagine in a world where you are constantly living in the fear of many gods who aren't moral or just necessarily, but death is continually in your face, whether it's natural disaster, whether it's war, violence, or whether it's sickness that you can do nothing about. Death was an in-your-face reality beyond what we, I think, even are able to imagine today, because today we kind of protect ourselves from death so quickly. We ship it off and we outsource it, and we don't want to face it. But in a community where you are continually faced with the horror and the suffering and the pain of death, where the average lifespan was, not a fraction of what it is today. And the explanation is, well, there's just nothing you can do about it. if the storm god gets angry at the wind god, and the earth god, and they all get in fights and whatever, and natural disasters comes yearly and takes the lives of much of your community, it brings people into a place of both anxiety and the feeling of total powerlessness. And what are we to fight against the gods? Our only hope is to get incantations. One of the stories is the tree of life that was alive and well in the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's very old. And how they would just try and find some magic substances to help protect them just through one more week or one more month. But we are essentially powerless against these impersonal forces. In the context of that, here, I see God breaking through the imagination of this writer that starts telling us, no, I want to give you a new vision of this world and of who you are. It is good. It is good. Now it's interesting. It's good. It's not perfect. You know, if in Hebrew, if you want to, you don't have comparative terms like good, better, best, or good, better, perfect. What you would say, if something's good, you would say tuf. If it's very good, you would say tuf, tuf. And if it's perfect, you would say tuf, tuf, tuf. 3 tufs. Now, it's interesting, every time God creates, he says, this is tuf. Eventually he makes man and he says, this is tuf, tuf. This is very good. But he never pronounces anything to be perfect, to be tuf, tuf, tuf. So in that context where the Genesis scripture comes to fundamentally challenges people's view about the divine, about humanity, about creation, to come and say, you don't have to live in continual fear. God has made it all good, and you are the crown of his creation. You are not powerless. In fact, he entrusts you with this planet to look after it. In that view, the next question that comes up is, well, where does evil come from then? Now, at this stage, there is no concept of Satan. When ancient Israelite religion made a transition from polytheism, and yes, there were many. Israelite religion, even some of the writers of some of the scriptures in the Bible were polytheistic in their worldview. But when they make the transition from polytheism to monotheism, from many gods to there's one God, which is a simplistic way of saying it, but it's for our purposes this the best way. When there's only one God, and there's no concept of anything beyond, in pure monotheism, everything proceeds from this one God, whether it's good or whether it's evil, whether it's disaster, whether it's blessing. In pure monotheism, God is the source of it all. This obviously is a great theory until it's people in your own family that suffer, and then you can't work out, how can you tell me again, how is God good? And this is happening. And so the theory continually clashed with the reality of life. That there's stuff that happens that contradicts a version of God's sovereignty that says he's in control of everything and he's good. There was continual tension in that. And so one of the first attempts to start telling man where is the origin of evil then comes from this story we have in Genesis 3. But let me start in Genesis 2. God creates another difference. He creates the difference between what is between man and woman. And it's beautiful. It says they were both naked, but unashamed. And the difference he created between the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is the difference between what produces life and what produces suffering, death, pain in this world. So in this picture, man and woman both naked, unashamed. Then the very next verse, chapter 3, says, and it's the word aram for naked. It says the snake was more aram, and there we translated it shrewd or wise. But it's the same word aram, naked, that we translated it just before there. So how can you translate the same word nakedness in one place and shrewd in the other place? Well, Genesis 42 verse 9 probably gives us a bit more insight into this. This is where Joseph accuses his brothers of being spies who came into the land to spy out the nakedness of the land. And what he means by that is spies would come to see where your borders are weak. Where are you vulnerable to penetration as a nation? So in this same sense, man and woman were both naked, vulnerable, but they were unashamed. Why? Because they've never used their vulnerability to harm one another. So there's no shame in vulnerability. In fact, you need vulnerability if you want to be intimate. But unfortunately, the same quality that makes you intimate makes you vulnerable to being harmed and hurt. And so the snake becomes the symbol of the one who's going to twist this vulnerability. And the whole chapter 3 is full of mimetic symbolism and pictures. It speaks about fruit, about eating, about touching, about the pleasure of seeing. It's all pictures of, or words that you would relate to desire. And the snake says to Eve, has God said you should not eat? And she said, yes, he said we shouldn't eat. We shouldn't even touch this fruit. So that's a bit of an exaggeration. Probably reveals a bit of anxiety in terms of don't even touch this. And then the suggestion is made clearly. The reason you will not die, the reason God does not want you to eat of this tree is because he doesn't want you to be like him. Okay, I want to show you what's the difference between the likeness that is on offer here and the likeness that was presented in Genesis 1:26. In Genesis 1:26, there is no third object of desire. There is God and man. God adores us. We reflect that desire, that adoration back. The suggestion and the perversion of desire that comes in Genesis 3 is a third object of desire is placed, a triangle of desire is placed within this equation. And the suggestion is made that the reason God doesn't want you to eat from this tree is because he does not want you to be like him. It implies that he wants this tree all for himself. Because somehow his very likeness, his very being is intertwined with the fruit that you get in this tree. And so the idea of a God who withholds is introduced. Now, what happens with a reflective being when we are presented with a picture of the God we are supposed to mirror as a God who withholds from us this tree because he wants it for himself? It makes that tree more desirable than any other tree. We want that tree. Because we are reflecting the God of our confusion. And in this place where a third object is brought into this triangle of desire, it now goes from, instead of in Genesis 1:28, desire drew us into one another, into intimacy with one another. But what happens now is it places man and God in rivalry with one another. God wants to withhold this tree. I want its fruit. And I'm going to eat it because I want to be, because behind the desire that is birthed out of lack, what is the lack that is suggested? It's a lack of being. If you can only eat of this tree, you can be like God. So the fruit itself is really just a mask for the underlying lack. It's not that we really just lack the fruit. We have a sense of insufficiency, a lack of being. And if I can only... And now the likeness that is on offer is a likeness that is in competition with God, which is very different from the first point of desire. So let me give a very simple example of how mimetic desire can be twisted in real life. You can imagine two young boys growing up and really enjoying one another's friendship because they enjoy the same kind of activities. We love fishing together, we love the outdoors, we love the same kind of sport, etc. And they think we've just been so lucky to meet another guy that is so much like me, and they might be, and probably they are, completely oblivious to the fact that their desires are mutually reinforcing. We don't really know anymore who was the one who suggested that we go hunting, but we both love it. You know, and it's supposed to be that. Desire is supposed to reinforce one another, and it draws us together in common enjoyment, and that is what binds us into common friendship and discovering that you guys love coffee shops. We love it too. And there, wow, that's a wonderful thing. We both enjoy the same activity and the same enjoyment, and it's part of what makes friendship possible. Is the fact that we transmit similar desires, and you can imagine these boys growing up, and in college suddenly they might notice the same girl and they both fall in love, and the fact that my friend likes her too just makes her even more desirable. And so the very quality that made friendship possible now becomes the quality that makes rivalry possible. Can you see that? So our reflective nature by itself is neutral. But when it is twisted to produce rivalry. Now even rivalry is not, competition is good. You know, and some of the most successful companies are those who compete to produce the best product without getting obsessed with the competition. They just focused on producing the best, because the way in which competition works between humans is if there's no limit to violence or to rivalry, it's not just competing to do the best or competing to get something. It very quickly spills into real, it can spill over into violence very quickly. Now, especially if you think of early human communities where there are no real prohibitions to violence, any kind of competition can very quickly become violent. So what we've done up to now is to show how desire can be both very positive, overflowing out of fullness, the very quality that draws us into union and intimacy with one another. But when it can also become very rivalistic, when it's birthed out of a lack of being, and I want to attain something that somebody else wants as well, that gets into rivalry. Now, I want to introduce you to a concept called mimetic theory, and that is the theory that takes these understandings of desire to its conclusion as to what it means for human society and culture. And what they've discovered in ancient civilizations across the world, no matter what part of the world you're in, at every place where humanity was suddenly advanced into a more complex society in which they grew beyond just a little tribe. Because you know, the most basic human unit would be a family. That would grow maybe into a tribe. But tribes trying to work together, often it's just violence and they wiped out. Because there's benefits of working together, we can hunt together, we can gather together, but rivalry and violence kept human groupings from becoming more advanced for many, many decades. What is the quality that suddenly allowed these small, primitive human communities to go from little tribes warring against one another to becoming a civilization in which there is order? And what they have found in all these early civilizations is at the heart of them, there was the practice of human sacrifice. So I want to deal a bit with what's the real nature of sacrifice and how Jesus comes to overturn it. Why would sacrifice be at the heart of every civilization? I'm going to give an example just of an agricultural community, of how this mimetic desire could lead to the practice of human sacrifice. This is just one example. I mean, once we start delving into the ancient origins of human civilization, we are pushing on something that's at the limits of our ability to grasp. I mean, most of us are just about making sense of our own lives. To make sense of human origins is a big leap. But much work has been done in this area. So this is just, obviously, this is not a factually, historically correct. It's an example of how anthropologists think the practice of sacrifice functioned in all these societies. And you can find it in a book called The Scapegoat by Mary-Anne Rabe. It's witness to also in all the ancient myths of how cities were established. And he, for many years, he deconstructed the myths and found that at the heart of all the myths, there is a founding murder. Why? At the heart of every myth, there's a founding murder, and at the heart of every ancient civilization, there's human sacrifice. So why don't you join me in your imaginative capacity? And imagine an agricultural community, a primitive agricultural community in which people are just starting to learn how to work together, how to function together. And there's no formal laws. And in this community, there's going to be many conflicts. Now, I noticed that guy really likes black and white goats. That means I like black and white goats, you know, because I don't even know that it's because I observed that I suddenly realized I like black and white goats. But the problem is there's only so many black and white goats. So what happens? Rivalry. I start scheming. How can I get more goats? And it might lead to stealing. It might, and being a reflective creature, I suspect that my rival is also scheming how he can get my black and white goats. And so I am watching him carefully. Is he making schemes to get my black and white? And very soon confirmation comes. And I become obsessed with the rival. And the more the competition and rivalry grows, the less important the goats are. Because the real object, the real need is a need of being, not just the need of the goats. And so ultimately, I don't just want your goats, I want to replace you in a search for being. Now, you can imagine in a small community, let's say 100, 200 people, who's starting to work together, there's a lot of rivalry, there's a lot of conflict, and eventually some violence spills over. And violence by its very nature produces more violence. You kill one of our family, we'll kill 5 of yours. That's the nature of unrestrained violence. It escalates. And many, many, many communities totally disintegrated because of this violent cycle. What is it that helps us break through that violent cycle into establishing more stable communities? In this place where many conflicts are constantly working within this community, and profane violence, this violence that's busy disrupting our whole community, is at the point where it's again going to destroy the whole community. At this point where it reaches its boiling point, suddenly all the conflicts converge into one, and we've discovered that it is better that one should die for the community rather than the whole community perish. And at that point, and we can go through many of the myths, but what would happen is a scapegoat would be chosen, a person that's just a bit different, a person that's maybe the last one to come into the community, the outsider, or someone that doesn't have many family connections, so that reprisals wouldn't be too costly. But the scapegoat is chosen, and there's nothing that unites old enemies more than finding a common new enemy. And so, because we're dealing with symbols in any case, it is so easy to replace these rivalries and the search for being with a new culprit. And so now I don't really care anymore that we had a fight about goats. We are at such a place of frustration that we just need to give expression to that frustration, and the kind of communal catharsis takes place where we choose a scapegoat. A communal murder takes place where everybody now agrees it is this person's fault, because as reflective beings we have the capacity to project our own evil onto others. And that's exactly what happens here. We don't know the source of our irritation. We don't know the source of our frustration. And so we find something or someone to demonize. And we project our own evils onto the scapegoat. And the effect of a communal murder, and we're going to get to what it means for us today, but we need to go back and see where do we come from, kind of realize what kind of societies we live in today and why we function the way we do, and why is the sacrifice of Jesus so subversive that it brings to end the sacrificial practice. The effect of this sacrifice is phenomenal. There's nothing that unites the community more than having found a common enemy. It is so powerful because it works. You know the word satanos. the accuser, the one Jesus says, how is it that Satan casts out Satan? In other words, the very accusations within a community that brings us to a place of disorder suddenly converses into and melts into one single accusation that brings order. So he's got this thing neatly wrapped up. He's the source of the chaos, and then he's the source of the order. And this cycle is something we cannot even see what's happening in it by itself because we are so involved in it. The whole cycle relies on us being unaware of what is actually happening. And so the very Satan that causes disorder is the Satan that brings order. And suddenly we recognize a new kind of violence. Instead of the violence that just destroyed our community, this violence united our community. So it becomes sacred violence. It becomes part of a ritual, part of a religion. Religion has its birth in the most horrific satanic murder, which is the origin of sacrifice. Now, what happens when the whole community is suddenly at peace, and this has worked so well? We've got to explain what happened. We are deeply disturbed by the fact that we could murder one of our own, but yet the effects are so beneficial, it must be somehow, it must be good. And so all kinds of myths develop. Myths about the guilt of the scapegoat. He must have been guilty. Myths about gods who delight in the blood of the guilty. I mean, the fact that the gods brought peace to our community after this murder must mean that they are very pleased with the sacrifice and with the blood of this victim. And so our myths begin in this event of deception, and it continues because we want to deny the deeply disturbing nature of our own violence. So the myths always try to deny that there was violence. Somebody willingly threw themselves in the fire. It wasn't us. We asked for a volunteer, and the Mayan myth, where they asked for a volunteer, and it says he walked up to the edge of the fire, but he did not have the courage. He walked back. He did this 3 times, but with the encouragement of his brothers that surrounded him, he jumped. Now we can see that there is something true in this myth and something false. The truth is somebody was murdered. The truth is somebody died. The untruth is we don't want to acknowledge that the community murdered this person. He volunteered. He jumped into that fire. Now, myth after myth after myth tells that same story. René Girard, who deconstructed all these myths, he was brought up Catholic, but he wasn't a practicing believer. And in this period, the French philosopher and literary critic, but he did most of his work in the USA. During this time, he went to church for the first time in many, many years. And as he sat in the pew and he looked at the Bible in front of him, he thought, yes, I've deconstructed all the literary treasures of this world, and here's a book that has influenced this world more than anything else, and I haven't bothered reading it for so long. And he opens it up, and to his absolute surprise, what he has worked on for many years to deconstruct the myths, to reveal what they tried to hide, he finds that the scriptures tells the same story, but at every point where the myth tries to hide, the scriptures reveals what is actually happening. So the Bible also tells us that the first civilization, the city of the Canaanites, was established by the first murderer, Cain. So the first murder, the first sin, the first civilization, and the first sacrifice is all mentioned in the first story in the scriptures as well. So I can even take the 10 Commandments and show you the mimetic process. Let's go from Commandment 6 to Commandment 10. Commandment 6, you shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. It's like the writer can go on and on and on and on. So he says, okay, let's get to the bottom line. What is it that produces all these wrong stuff within human communities? Let's get to the heart of it, the last commandment. You shall not desire what is your neighbor's. I like the old King James. You shall not desire your neighbor's ass. The new one says your neighbor's donkey. And, so the whole concept is this conflict begins in desire. James 4. Where does conflict and wars, where do they originate amongst you? Isn't it in your own perverted desires? Read it, James 4. You desire and you have not. And there's this conflict because your desires has been stirred by the wrong motives. That's the very origin of the conflicts and the wars amongst you. And the whole book, the first 11 chapters of Genesis is the same originating story to tell us what is at the heart of human problems. In a world where they believed we are just at the mercy of the gods, we've got no power of what happens, the writer of Genesis wants to come and tell people, no, it is the knowledge that you partake of and the desires that you allow to be perverted that is the origin of the violence in this world. This was radical, because if you believe you have no power, what this scripture is actually saying is, in spite of one sovereign God who made everything good, he gave you the capacity to resist his will. That's radical, even today. But you can resist the goodness of God. And he allows it. And so the story of Genesis races from the violence in Cain and Abel to Lamech just a little while later, who says, a youth has struck me and I murdered him. And if Cain was avenged 70 times 7, or 7 times, I will be avenged 70 times 7. Can you see how quickly violence escalates? Now somebody can just hit you and I can kill him. And if you try and take vengeance, all hell's going to break loose. We're just going to murder whatever we can. So violence is escalating. And so we get to the Noah story. What's happening here? Violence has filled the earth, and the desires of men's hearts were evil continually. Can you see that these stories are trying to get us to what is the very source of our problems? It has to do with desire, which has its ultimate expression in violence. But the scripture is starting to invert our myths. Something that you might not know, but rabbis and Jewish scholars who have studied this from ancient times knows that the Jewish rabbis always use myth to deconstruct myth. So they will take the same kind of stories, the same kind of pictures, and tell a story that's familiar in their culture and in their world, that they will change the content. So they will tell a similar story, but at the end, God is good instead of evil. At the end, man has got a choice as to what he allows in his world instead of you just powerless. You must just accept. So they use these stories to deconstruct the popular stories of their day. And so in a world where sacrificial stories, myths sprout up, what is the deception of these stories? Number one, it tells us that violence is redemptive. That you can solve the problems within your community, within your family, through violence. Because ultimately, God uses violence to solve his problems. It tells us about angry gods who demand blood. It tells us of guilty scapegoats within our community. That somehow we've got to locate evil in evil people. And if we can just get rid of evil people, we'll get rid of evil in our world. That's never worked. Because evil is much more pervasive than just something that is located in one person. It's a cycle that can be easily twisted. So here we get to the Noah story. And I just want to give you just one insight into the story, because throughout the scriptures it's going to start inversing this idea of sacrifice. So in the Noah story, what happens here is the very inverse of what happens in all the myths. In all the myths, it is the minority that is guilty and needs to be expelled or murdered, and the community is innocent. Why is that the myths? Because it is the community and the leaders that writes the stories. Okay? But in this story, it's the very inverse that happens. The community, the whole world is guilty, and there's a minority that's innocent. Now, it by no means debunks the whole sacrificial myth, but it introduces an idea to humanity. The majority might not be right. The minority might be innocent. It's starting to introduce ideas to us. Now, this idea is going to be completely inversed as we start looking at other stories throughout the Old Testament. Maybe, how long have I gone now? So I started about 8.
Yeah.
So I want to take the sacrificial, how God starts changing the idea of sacrifice, because even while the scribes are writing Leviticus about sacrifice, God whispers to the prophets and he says, please tell them that sacrifices and offerings I did not desire. Okay, I'm doing this because it's the only bloody language you understand. But it is not what I need. I don't want the blood, but I'm entering onto your level to communicate in the only mythical understanding language you know, to inverse the very process of what sacrifice means. But let's take a 10-minute break, and we do that, and when we do the last half an hour, we'll look at the sacrificial stories like of Abraham, etc., where God starts to inverse it. So we do that. Thank you.